Understanding fundamentals is always the most important part of mixing and mastering, but some tricks and easy to implement techniques can go a long way. The tips in this video may mean the difference between a good mix and a great one, so let's get into the best low-end mixing tricks. First up, we have Pultec Boost Cut Trick. So this is something that you can do with any Pultec EQ, including this free Portec EQ from Analog Obsession. Set the frequency to 20 Hz, amplify the band, then cut it to a lesser extent. This amplifies the lows while attenuating the low mids. By reducing the low mids, we reduce masking to higher frequencies, which means the impact and percussive elements of low frequency instruments, which occupy higher frequencies, are easier to hear. The combination of boosting the subs and the lows while dipping low mids makes your kick and your bass sound less muddy and more impressive and impactful. So let's take a listen to it on a bass track. Next up, let's cover timing kick and bass compression. To create cohesion in the low end, time both the kick and the bass to the BPM of the track by carefully timing your release time. 60,000 divided by the BPM will give you a quarter note in milliseconds. Use this time, or a multiple of it, as the release time for both the kick and bass. As for the attack time, you could subtract it from the release time. However, compression begins right when the signal passes the threshold. The attack time refers to how long before the maximum amount of attenuation, but a lot of attenuation occurs right at the beginning. So I'd recommend timing the kick to a quarter note and the bass to a half note, but experiment to find what sounds best. When it comes to ducking the bass whenever the kick hits, the same idea should be used. Time the attenuation to the BPM to keep it sounding musical. Let's take a listen to it. Next up, let's cover the best low-end saturation. When saturating an instrument, like a kick or a bass, it's best to do the following. Use a frequency-specific saturation plugin, and if you don't have one, I'll show a different method in just a moment. With it, isolate the fundamental range of the instrument, that is, the range with all of the fundamental frequencies. If it's the kick, it's likely going to be just one fundamental, unless it's an 808. If it's the bass, it'll move around as the note changes. Once it's isolated, saturate the frequency range above it. This is going to cause higher order harmonics to form, which, similar to the Pultec trick, emphasizes the percussive aspects of the instrument, and it brings the instrument forward. If we were to saturate the full signal, or maybe just the fundamental range, the harmonics would likely form in the low mids, which would emphasize a range that already has a high enough amplitude more often than not. Furthermore, saturating the lowest frequencies can wave shape them enough to create a new, higher frequency. By saturating the range above it, we avoid any modulation to the lows that would cause the perception of a new frequency, and we generate harmonics in an area that actually benefits from the additional amplitude. Now, if you don't have a frequency-specific saturator, try an emphasis-de-emphasis technique instead. Before the saturator, use an EQ to attenuate the fundamental range with a shelf and boost the ranges above it. This makes it more likely that the saturator will be triggered by those frequencies and not just the fundamental. After the saturator, use an equal and opposite EQ to rebalance the response. So let's take a listen to saturation to the ranges above the fundamental and compare it to saturation to the fundamental range. Notice how the generated harmonics fill higher frequencies when the higher range is saturated, and how aggressive saturation to the lowest frequencies causes them to sound slightly out of tune. Get professional analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head. Seriously though, when people work with us, they get results. That's why major industry professionals like Keith Urban's producer Aaron Schurz works with us, Grammy award-winning AJ Castillo, Billboard #1 charted artist Megan Lindsay, Grammy Award-winning artist Toolis, The Voice singer Cody Ballou, Grammy-nominated producer Tyler Kane, Warner Music artist Ricky Young, and the list goes on. Watch the rest of this video, and at the end, use the link in the description to get direct access to us for personalized analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head. Next up, let's use a correlation meter on the lows. Using your ear is best, but there's nothing wrong with confirming something with an analyzer. When it comes to low frequencies, it's best if they have a correlation near 1. In other words, it's best if the left and the right channels are identical or nearly identical below about 200 Hz. To check this, you could use the free plugin Isolate by TV Pro Audio and place it on the stereo output. Then adjust the low frequency range as needed and solo the low frequency range. Then insert a stock correlation meter to measure the correlation of only the low frequencies. If you're reading a correlation of less than 0.9, then you have a low end that doesn't translate well to mono devices. Additionally, phase interference between the two channels may make the kick and the bass less driving or focused. Now, for some genres like classical and jazz, a decorrelated low range is okay, but for others, it's not going to sound right to listeners. To fix this, first check that your kick and your bass are centered pan-wise. If they are, try mid-side equalizers on the kick stem, the bass stem, or possibly the stereo mix, and use a side image high-pass filter to attenuate differences between the left and the right channels. So let's listen to a drum stem and a bass track with spread info in the low frequency range. Then we'll listen to it with the side image high pass engaged. Notice how the low end instantly becomes focused. Next up, let's cover reverb on low instruments. So engineers often dismiss using reverb on the kick or the bass, but I'd argue that it's just not being done correctly. Earlier in the video, I mentioned how aggressive saturation to low frequencies can cause the perception of a different frequency. In short, the notes in the low range are very close together, so any modulation in this range can shift the frequencies enough to become a different note. This is especially true for reverb, delay, chorusing, or any time-based effect. Reverb often introduces mild frequency modulation, both intentionally to make the effect sound more realistic, and unintentionally through mild phase cancellation between the left and the right channels. With that in mind, if you want some reverb on a kick or a bass, ensure that low-frequency reflections are attenuated. For example, if I wanted some room reverb on a kick sample to make it sound a little more natural, I'd use a high-pass filter to attenuate any reflections below roughly 200 Hz. If you want to be more exact about it, you could find the fundamental frequency or frequencies of the instrument and set the high pass about 60 Hz above that. This way, the filter slope will attenuate the majority of reflections in the fundamental range. So let's take a listen to reverb with modulation introduced to low frequency instruments. If you listen carefully, you can hear subtle pitch shifting. Then I'll enable the high pass filter and notice how the effect blends in much better. Get professional analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head. Seriously though, when people work with us, they get results. That's why major industry professionals like Keith Urban's producer Aaron Schurz works with us, Grammy award-winning AJ Castillo, Billboard #1 charted artist Megan Lindsay, Grammy award-winning artist Toolis, The Voice singer Cody Ballou, Grammy-nominated producer Tyler Kane, Warner Music artist Ricky Young, and the list goes on. Why waste your time creating masters that don't accurately translate what you hear in your head when you could instantly fix a problem by clicking the link in the description and working directly with professionals who have already done what you're trying to do. We've mastered thousands of songs that accurately translate what each client hears in their head, and it'll work for you too. Click the link in the description now and get direct access to us for personalized analog mastering that accurately translates what you hear in your head.